Hello and welcome to the President's Podcast right here on The Record with the Ohio Senate. The views the news excludes. I'm your host, John Fortney, the Director of Communication with the Majority Caucus, the Republican Caucus here in the Ohio Senate. This week on the President's Podcast, great to have on the program State Senator Andrew Brenner, Republican from Delaware, Ohio, just north of Columbus in Delaware County. He also serves as the chair of our Education Committee. Welcome.
Thank you for having me on.
You know, it's been a big year, a big budget for K-12 education, record-setting funding. And you like to kind of set the record straight about how much more money was put into our public schools.
$2 billion more. In fact, we are spending more than we've ever spent in the state of Ohio on K-12 public education. Not only that, but over the last couple of years, we have moved the money that used to flow through the local school districts for community schools, which are charter schools, and or Ed Choice scholarships, and the state is now picking up 100% of that. It doesn't go through the local districts, so that is not money that is being taken away from those local districts. We have moved forward on the Cupp-Patterson bill to fully fund it, so we're well into our phasing of the Cupp-Patterson bill. And this last budget that was approved last year that we voted for, we did increase funding by about $2 billion. We're spending in the state level about $9.5 billion per year. That is up about 12 to 13% over the prior year. So this is a substantial increase in funding. So anybody, and I know at least one of my colleagues has suggested that we have cut funding. That is not true. The funding has increased substantially. But not only has it increased substantially from that standpoint, we've also increased funding for the scholarships directly. So Ed Choice scholarships, the community schools received a substantial increase in funding. But again, all that funding is going directly to the schools. It's not coming out of local tax levies. So for your viewers who are concerned, okay, well, my local tax dollars are being taken and used out of my local school to pay for these. No, they're not. The state is using it through our state income taxes. That is approved through the general operating budget, and these are additional dollars that are put into our school funding formula.
Yeah, you had a really strong column in response to Senator Bill DeMora, your colleague on the other side of the aisle. Of course, some of this you kind of wonder if it's not a little bit of election year politics being out there on the opinion page. But you also you can read the unabridged version of that on The Record, our online hybrid newsroom on The Record that Senator Brenner penned. So it also goes a little bit more in depth, and to find on The Record, just go to ohiosenate.gov. Go all the way over, click on News, and see On the Record, and click on The Record, and just pull down, you can see Senator Brenner's column on that. You know, as I think back when I was in the news business and a reporter, I covered a lot of public policy and state politics. And when the original DeRolf lawsuit happened, and then the actual ruling came out, I believe it was in, 97, I think was when the original suit happened. But since then, after the school funding system was found unconstitutional, we continue to hear the narrative that it remains unconstitutional. But after the Supreme Court released the case in 2002, there have been 12 separate budgets since then. Would you argue that this whole narrative of the funding system being unconstitutional is nothing but politics and trying to push a false political narrative for campaign purposes?
The far left, and that would be the entire Democrat Party and machine and apparatus, has been pushing this narrative that we have never fully funded the school system and that we're still unconstitutional based on a Supreme Court ruling from nearly 30 years ago. And as you pointed out, there were several Supreme Court rulings between 97 and 2002. 2002 was the last time they did it, and they said, look, it's up to the General Assembly to fully fund it. At the time, the General Assembly created the Ohio Construction Facilities Commission to deal with literally building hundreds of buildings in the state of Ohio. And so we actually moved a lot of money into school funding at that time to help meet the DeRolf decision. And this was over 20 years ago. So that doesn't count all the funding that we've increased over the last couple of years for school funding.
Yeah, it was called the Ohio School Construction Facilities Commission or School Facilities Commission, and that happened since 1997. $14 billion and counting in new school construction. It's now called the Facilities Construction Commission. It has a different name, but 14 billion and counting. 300 districts so far had all their schools built or updated through the OFCC, the Ohio Facilities Construction Commission, and there are still 118, more than 100 projects still underway. Construction continues to this day. So as this started off out of Perry County with the dilapidated building, and without a doubt, many of those buildings, especially in rural Ohio, not just in Perry County, they were really in disrepair. But now you drive by some of these districts and they're brand new buildings.
Well, even the school districts that are the considered high wealth districts, and I represent a lot of them, like Olentangy's. I was in Big Walnut schools this week. They've got newer facilities, but that's all paid for out of local taxpayer dollars, and these are really outstanding buildings. I mean, you go in there, you're like, wow. So we've gone a long way from buildings that were dilapidated. Now, that being said, you've got school districts throughout Ohio and central Ohio and the suburban districts that make tough decisions when they're spending their dollars because they're growing rapidly. But you've got other school districts like the city of Columbus. They have 44,500 students. Yet they have 118 school buildings and buildings in there. And Olentangy has 27 buildings for nearly 24,000 students. So some of these districts need to start making tough decisions, consolidating, make the economies of scale work better. If they do that, that'll reduce the cost of educating students versus increasing the cost of educating students.
That's a good point. That's something nobody ever likes to face. Obviously, you like to go to that school that's close or wherever it is. I can think to what my old school system did. There were elementary schools throughout Washington County and Warren local schools, Little Hocking, and there was Warren Elementary in BV. And then after a while, it just became, we need new buildings. Let's put all the elementaries in one place right next to the high school, and it winds up actually having an economy of scale in the long term.
Absolutely. In fact, the districts even in my area did that 20, 40, 50 years ago, and what you see a better economies of scale. The transportation is much more efficient, whereas in many of the urban counties the transportation is not efficient. We see a lot of schools, especially the charter school community and the charter non-publics, their kids are not getting picked up. They should be, but because these big urban school districts have not done their due diligence at improving their districts, they've allowed the transportation to fall apart and a lot of these kids to just not get picked up in the morning or even in the middle of the school day. I've heard that many of these schools will be called by the traditional district saying, we can't take your kids home that day, and that's a problem.
And yet they say that we don't have the money to do that. But if you look, you can find it easily. It's all available on the Department of Education and Workforce website. But it's called the 5-year forecast or the cash balance carryover. And you can find this for each of the 611-ish school districts throughout the state of Ohio. You mentioned this in your column where in 2023, the district cash balance overall for the whole state of Ohio was
approximately $9.6 billion.
$9.6 billion. And Columbus Public Schools at the end of 2023 had a $244 million cash carryover and forecasted a $347 million cash carryover in 2025. And they just passed a brand new school levy. So that, after a while, taxpayers should be asking questions about, do you really need this money or do you need to run a tighter ship?
I believe they need to run a tighter ship, and the taxpayers should be asking those questions because I've talked to the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce. Most school districts used to have a 10 to 20% carryover cash balance, which would be about 20% of their annual expenditures. Many of these districts today have between 60 and 150% of their annual expenditures in cash carryover. No business has that kind of cash sitting around. No small business does, and taxpayers clearly don't. So school districts, I think, need to be reconsidering putting a lot of these issues on the ballot and having taxpayers try to pick up these costs.
And one of the things, too, when you take a look at where we are enrollment-wise, over the last 30 years. There's some statistics out there through the Department of Education that says enrollment over the last 30 years has dropped by 6% in Ohio. Fordham put out its recent educational study on the state of Ohio and said from 2006 to 2023, so in the last 17 years, enrollment dropped by almost 10%, and that there was about a 6% to 6.5% drop in the number of teachers. How concerned should we be with those figures?
We should be very concerned because what's happened here in Central Ohio, it's growing and you're seeing student growth in enrollment, and it's pretty substantial. But most of the rest of the state, you look at Northeastern Ohio, they've had a substantial fall off in the number of students in those schools, yet the revenue per student keeps going up because we have not cut the funding where it needs to be cut, which is where you've got declining enrollment. And so they haven't made tough decisions, which is why you're seeing the revenue per student for expenditures in these school districts, and such as Youngstown or Cleveland and some of those areas, in the $25,000 to $30,000 plus per student. You know, you've got rural districts and suburban districts that are spending between $10,000 and $13,000 a student. Yet these districts that have lost significant amounts of kids, instead of making tough decisions, closing schools, consolidating, they're continuing to get the funding. And the reason why, yes, there's high poverty, but the results also aren't there in those districts. And if you take a look at the academic scores coming out of the students on the standardized test scores for English and math, they've not improved in 20 or 30 years. We are doing what we can. I think that's why school choice is very optional and optimal for those kids. But when you're spending $25,000 to $30,000 or more per student, and you're only getting about 20 to 30% of your children to be able to pass a state standardized test in English or math, you've got a problem.
Yeah, the statewide per pupil spending average is $15,427, but as you point out, some of these more urban districts are spending well over $20,000 per pupil, so you would think there would be some results to show for it. Let's talk a little bit about results. Mm-hmm. On the statewide, this is from the Department of Education and Workforce. You can find these numbers on the state website. The statewide achievement for fourth grade English language arts, so can you read, can you comprehend, 59% of fourth graders basically were proficient in that. Fourth grade math, 67%. Then if you go on to eighth grade, English language, 58%, eighth grade math, only 46%. How concerned should we be? What needs to change? And I know compound question here, but how big of an impact did the pandemic have when children were not in school, and it seems like we didn't know where a lot of these kids were to begin with?
That's actually, the pandemic probably finally put the magnifying glass on these districts because people could then see what was happening. It's unfortunate they were shut down. It put a lot of these kids way behind, and you can see that based on the test scores. Many of these kids were falling behind way before this. The pandemic exacerbated it, and the government response to the pandemic completely torpedoed it, and a lot of that you can fall on the blame goes on to the teachers' unions. They were concerned about health, which I can understand, but they wanted these schools and stuff shut down way beyond when every other business and everybody else were back to business. And that caused the additional academic fall off on many of these kids. So we've got kids right now in some of these districts, especially the districts that were closed for a year or more, were on severe, stringent lockdown guidelines. Some of these kids are passing in the 20% range, 30. So that means 70, 80, 90% of their kids are failing the state proficiency test. We should be in panic mode. We should be doing everything we can to get these kids remediated.
To put it in simple terms, these kids can't read and write.
Correct.
Right. 2023 end of course exams, that's the high school level. Algebra 2, 61%. Algebra 1, 53%. Geometry, 41%. Biology, 63%. United States government, in other words, in my day, you would call that civics, 72%, and U.S. history, 70%. That seems to also be translating, if you take a look at ACT scores, if you go back to 2017, Ohio had a 22 average ACT score to qualify to get into college entrance exams. Nationally, it was 21. In 2023, however, we slipped from a 22 down to 19.2. And it's a slippery slope when you're not educating kids at the K through 12 level and then expecting them to get in the upper 20s of an ACT score. And we have all this new industry coming into Ohio, especially in central Ohio. Intel, all these high technology jobs, even petroleum engineering jobs, where you have to be able to do the math.
Yes, if you can't do the math, if you can't read, you're not going to be able to do even the basic jobs, let alone these high-tech jobs that are coming to central Ohio. So that's why I think it's even more imperative that we get these kids remediated and we start showing some accountability in our local school districts to be able to do it. And that's one more thing. I hear a lot of times that they blame the charter schools are the ones that are not, held to any kind of account. Actually, they are. We have closed numerous charter schools over the years with all the changes that we put into place about 8-9 years ago. So we can shut those school districts or those school buildings down in those charters, and so they're held accountable. Our traditional districts, though, that are underperforming those same charter schools, we keep open. And I think it's a time that we start looking at how we're handling that as well.
As part of the new 2-year state budget, we went to universal scholarships, or the Ed Choice expansion. So here's the breakdown on that. A scholarship for a K through 8 student is a little bit more than $6,100, $6,185. 9 through 12, $8,400. And the way that works is families qualify up to 450% of the poverty level, which is approximately $135,000. And then over that, it's a sliding scale of the amount of a scholarship that they would qualify for. So far this year, 82,000 vouchers or scholarships and counting. That has received a lot of criticism from the left about a drain away from public schools if we were only putting this money into public schools, and look what it's costing the state of Ohio, yet it's actually saving the state of Ohio money and empowering parents to make the decisions that are right for their child and their family.
Think about it. If you have kids that are in a school district where 70, 80, 90% of the kids are going to fail the state standardized test, and you have an opportunity to put your kid in a high school with an $8,400 a year scholarship so that you can now afford to put your kid into that school, are you going to take it? Yes, you are. But not only that, you're putting that $8,400 that we're spending to a kid that is actually going to be able to learn something. And that is countless as to how much that is worth. But the other thing is, if you're only spending $8,400 for a kid to use an Ed Choice scholarship, you're not spending $26,000 to $35,000 a year for a traditional public school. So that is money that is freed up that could help fully fund the school funding formula, especially for all those school districts that are shortchanged in the funding formula right now, which are usually the high wealth districts. So those people are paying a lot higher property taxes because of failed school districts. And if you put these kids on Ed Choice scholarships, you're giving those families a better option. And I think that everybody should be promoting them.
The Ed Choice scholarship has been something that President Huffman has really been a champion of since his time began in the legislature. Bill Phillis, of course, represents the Ohio Coalition for Equity and Adequacy of School Funding. It was the original organization that brought the original DeRolf lawsuit. And they, of course, are challenging the Ed Choice scholarship program in court. He ended one of his recent columns in a Northern Ohio newspaper by saying this: "The voucher extremist campaign is part of a movement to plunder the commons, to privatize all public institutions, beginning with the common school. Ohioans, beware." I don't know of any of our members, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, I really don't know any of our members who thinks that public education is the big enemy here.
Nobody does. In fact, what he's saying is just utter nonsense. Even if we wanted to do what he suggested, there is no capacity in the state of Ohio to even come close to doing what he wants. And there are areas of the state where there's just no way you're going to be able to do what he suggests is going to happen. We want a rising tide lifts all boats for all kids in every single family so that every student is successful. And if you've got a competition coming maybe from some of those private schools, the public schools will have to get better because they don't want to lose their kids. So this idea that we want to do away with them, we can't. There's 1.6 million students in Ohio that go to traditional public schools. You're not going to just wipe that out overnight. You're not even going to wipe that out over decades. So this idea that he has is just he's doing that to scare people. And not only that, he's lying to people. Let's just be blunt. He's lying to the public. And I believe that if this if the Supreme Court reviews all the data on their newest lawsuit, they'll rule against him, because we have substantially increased the funding to traditional public schools. We've substantially given additional options for kids and families, and we've done it all within our budget, and we've been able to do it, I think in a way that is balanced, but it helps every single family in every single school district.
Yeah, special interest organizations, they want to remain in business. And so to do so, they have to say or do something where their contributors will contribute to them. And we also see a lot of for example, the Ohio Education Association campaign arm doesn't. That if you read Senator Brenner's column, I thought it was very interesting that you pointed out how I didn't see the OEA campaign arm contributing to educational issues. They contributed to a lot of far-left political groups that want to back redistricting campaigns or ballot initiatives of some kind. And I never saw one single contribution, if you read the column, to any actual educational issue.
And that's the problem. They're not worrying about the kids. They're worrying about their own special interests and other things that have nothing to do with education. And the money that's going to people that are paying into this union, many of people, they don't have to. These teachers do not have to pay into the unions. That was ruled upon by the U.S. Supreme Court, but they still do. And those dollars do not go to deal with a lot of educational things. And you're right, redistricting reform, that has nothing to do with school districts. It has nothing to do with public education. Now, their argument is, oh, well, ancillarily, we might try to elect somebody different. But even here in Ohio, we moved the court candidates, the judicial candidates running for Supreme Court and Appeals Court. We added R's and D's to the end of the name, and guess what? More people voted for Republicans than ever before because they actually knew that they were Republicans. So this is not a state that is moving to the left. This is a state that's been moving to the right. It's a state that's been moving to common sense. And it's been a state that wants to see their taxpayer dollars used more efficiently and not just wasted on stuff that the unions want, that's some woke program or DEI program that isn't helping the kids at all.
More information is always better in an election. So when the party affiliation was added to those races, people had more information, and you saw a very small percentage of undervote that was very large in many of the judicial races in the past elections. So it definitely enfranchised. It empowered voters. It didn't disenfranchise voters. Absolutely. How big of a step forward was the reform of the old Department of Education into the new Department of Education and Workforce, the realignment that actually gives some type of oversight to the executive branch? Because under the old way, there really wasn't any oversight or teeth. And the president would even talk about how he would ask for an answer from the department, and basically the answer was, we don't work for you.
It was so bad. So the State Board of Education appoints the superintendent, and they're supposed to have oversight over the Department of, at the time, Education. They would argue and squabble over procedural issues inside every one of their meetings. They would never get to the point of what they needed to do, which is their oversight responsibilities. And it's not to say that these are bad people on the board, but the board is so cumbersome, and there was no accountability because half the members of the board were appointed and the other half were elected, but they're elected in areas that nobody would know who their board member is because each board member would represent 1 million people. I mean, it's hard enough as a state senator representing about 360,000 people, let alone, a board member who has no staff to be able to even call on the department to answer their, simple questions about budgeting and so forth. So putting this person and creating a cabinet level position along with 2 deputy directors and combining the fact that you've got, career tech and workforce and you've got kids, so you want them to be ready to go into either careers or go into higher ed, and you want to make sure your K-12 system is working together, and combining those underneath one new director underneath the governor, and the governor is accountable to the public. The governor is also accountable to the General Assembly. So if we don't like what he's doing, we can always change the laws, and that's any governor. It doesn't matter, whether it's Governor DeWine or some future governor. So I think this check and balance will add, and they're now looking at making more efficiencies in the Department of Education and Workforce, because you had lots of programs that were doing a lot of the same things. So you had a lot of duplication of efforts. That created additional bureaucracy that local schools would have to fill out paperwork, or community schools or whatever would have to fill out all this extra paperwork to try to get grants and things. And in fact, I think this streamlining will, improve education in the long run, because it will improve the efficiencies of the department. It should also improve the communication between the department as well as all the local schools, as well as our community schools. And there is, again, the governor is at the top of that, because he's the one that's accountable to the voters. He's somebody that we can go and complain to. And or the check and balance would be to go to your legislators, which you really didn't have that when the state school board was overseeing it.
Reducing bureaucracy. What a wonderful idea that would be. Increasing efficiencies and results. You're a non-voting member of the state school board. There's been a few stories written here recently about the school board and its new duties that basically deal with teacher licensing, correct? Okay. The president was asked recently after one of our sessions about increasing the cost of a teacher license. He was not supportive of that and suggested, much like you were referring to earlier, that we take a look at what the administrative costs are right now with the state school board, especially after the total realignment and reassignment of duties. What is the cost of operating with your new set of duties? Are you in agreement with that?
Yeah, I think that the board needs to look at all their issues. So the board has oversight over territory transfers, licensure, and teacher discipline is all in that purview. There's about 70 employees in the Department of Education and Workforce that were assigned to the Board of Education after the restructuring. Those employees do licensure, they do all these investigations. So what the board should look at is, okay, what is getting referred down for investigations, and what could we do to maybe streamline those operations and maybe even outsource some of those operations? They've got a large IT staff. Maybe that IT staff could be outsourced, or maybe even outsourced to the Department of Education and Workforce or some third-party company, or even the background checks system could be maybe looked at as being outsourced and to companies that are more efficient. Other agencies do that. I know I'm licensed in insurance. That's done through a third-party company that's national. Those types of things can happen. They need to look at that. They need to then make a list of recommendations and come back to the General Assembly. We will look at those. If we think that they're reasonable, maybe if we need more funding for it, we will be able to do that. But they came out and they were requesting millions of more dollars, yet their actual costs were less than even what they were requesting. So I'd like to see them come out with some solid proposals. We'll take a look at it in the General Assembly and see what we need to do.
What would you say the state school board's duties have been reduced with the realignment or increased?
They've been substantially reduced with the realignment, yet scarily they were still arguing and squabbling over who should be the budget chair for their newly reorganized division. So it's with the board. So, and they got into a long argument over that. So if they can't even come to an agreement over who should be chairing their own budget committee without getting into massive arguments over it, it's going to be hard for them probably to come up with a proper budget and proper analysis. So I'm hopeful that they will be able to do something and come out with some recommendations that are meaningful. I do think they've selected a good person to be their state superintendent in Paul Kraft. I know Paul, he's a good man, he's a military guy, he's somebody who is, wants to get to the point. But the other thing that we need to look at is they said that the number of complaints against teachers have skyrocketed over the last 4 years since the pandemic. 17,000 complaints per year prior to the pandemic, 22,000 complaints per year. I would like to see if they could let us know, what are those complaints? Are these trivial? You want to make sure that the bad teachers are out of there, but you also don't want a bunch of trivial complaints coming in, bottling up the Department of Education and Workforce, or in this case, the board, and causing extra need for people that when you may not need to use these extra employees. Maybe these are things that could be done at the local level, at the local school board level. Let them deal with some of those issues, especially all these ancillary personnel that have been pulled into the school districts. And there are a lot of that has happened over the last 5 years.
Final thought from you about what is your message to Ohio parents about being involved in their child's education, about going to a school board meeting once in a while, about attending parent-teacher conferences? How important is parental involvement in this process?
You will not see an improvement in many of these districts without parental involvement. The parent has to be involved. They have to be involved with their students, day-to-day, homework, making sure that they're getting to school. They need to do the basic parental duties. But the next step is they need to attend those board meetings. They need to call their board members up. They need to call their principals up, their teachers up. If they've got issues, they need to reach out and talk to their local schools. Change includes transparency and oversight. Well, you've got board members that do some of the oversight, but parents are also oversight. It is very important that they do their duties as a parent to make sure that they're conveying their concerns to their local school board members. And if those things can't be resolved there, reach out to their state reps and their state senators so that we're aware of what's going on and that we can maybe enact legislation if need be to try to help improve our schools. And I think if they do that, I think we'll see an improvement in our schools in the long run.
As they say, all politics is local, especially at the grassroots. You don't get more grassroots than what the parents think when they go to a school board meeting. And parents should be an ally, not the enemy.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, I hear some school districts treating some of the parents as the enemy. That is unacceptable. And that's why I think parents need to speak up at their school board meetings. Make sure their board members know, hey, this is not acceptable. They're supposed to be accountable to us. Yes, the parents need to do their parental duties, but for kids to be educated, you have to have a system that works, and you've got to have everybody involved.
State Senator Andrew Brenner, Republican from Delaware, Ohio. Thanks for your time today. Thanks for talking with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.